Let me introduce the man of the hour, Manohar Kalwani, the OneAmerica Professor of Management in the Krannert School. Tell you a little bit about him. Professor Kalwani received his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology at Bombay and his PhD in management science from Columbia University. Before joining the Purdue faculty in 1980, Professor Kalwani served for 5 years on the faculty of the Sloan School at MIT. His research primarily focuses on applied probability models in marketing, consumer reference prices and sales promotions, order of entry, and business-to-business marketing. 4 of his Journal of Marketing research papers were finalists for the William Odell Award based on the paper's impact 5 years after its publication. And a paper with Das Noriandas, which I think is also the co-author for today's talk, was identified by the International Journal of Research and Marketing as among the top articles with the longest term impact over a 22-year period. He's a member of the founding editorial board of Marketing Science and has served on the editorial boards for both Marketing Science and the Journal of Marketing Research over a period of multiple decades. He has supervised over 40 doctoral dissertations, including 21 as dissertation committee chairs. These students have gone on to hold senior faculty positions at a number of prestigious universities, including Harvard and Michigan. He's been recognized repeatedly for excellence in teaching, including the R.B. and Mary Stewart Distinguished Teaching Award and the Salgo Noren Teaching Award on multiple occasions. Ladies and gentlemen, Manohar Kalwani.
Thank you very much, David. So for today, I was originally going to present my current research, which pertains to adoption of new technologies. And what we find is even significant innovations, such as in agricultural areas, such as composting, inorganic fertilizers, improved seed varieties, they don't get widely adopted. And so what we wanted to see, what role can marketing play through social marketing groups such as WeChat in the adoption of such innovations. I will be presenting that work at the Marketing Science Conference later this summer and also here at Krannert later in the summer. So we will make that announcement. So the work is we are not quite done with the analysis of the data, so I decided to switch gears and present some work that I had done, as David mentioned, with a former PhD student, Das Noriandas. So that work can be summarized with the following title: is Partnering good business for suppliers? It may be good for customers to partner with suppliers. How does that feel? How does that work out for suppliers on the other hand? So when there are long-term relationships between suppliers and manufacturing firms who are customers, it can be good for the customer. Is it good for the supplier? So how did this work get started? So it so happened a few years back, I was in a pinch hitting role. Somebody had left who was teaching business marketing class, and I the students wanted that class, so I decided, okay, there is demand for it, we will offer it. So for the first time, I was teaching that class. So when it comes to business to consumer marketing, consumer packaged goods or durable goods, we are customers ourselves, students are customers, and so they know sort of what's involved in choosing a brand, choosing an automobile, or choosing a toothpaste, or choosing any other consumer product. But when it comes to B2B products or B2B sector, what does it mean that Kirby Risk sells electrical parts, electrical components to Caterpillar? So what I decided I would do is have students in teams go out and sort of look at these relationships in which they would talk to both the buyer and the seller. So we took 6 companies in the area, Subaru, Isuzu. In those days, it was named Alcoa, Caterpillar, TRW, Great Lakes, and one more company. So we took 6 companies, and every student looked at 2 relationships, one that was working very well and one that was working okay. So there were about 12 relationships that we studied, and we got sort of interested in what we were learning from these projects that the students were doing. So we began to, and what we found was, for example, Caterpillar had a good relationship with Kirby Risk. On the other hand, with Johnson Precision, the relationship was not as good. Johnson Precision was dependent on Caterpillar for 85% of its sales. And a few years later, Johnson Precision folded. Anyway, so that's how this work got started. And at the time we started the work, these relationships were there was documented evidence that they are good for the customer firms. So the customer firms, they were what they would do is instead of buying some component part or some product from on an adversarial basis from 20, 30, 40 suppliers, what they decided to do was they would practice supplier focus, give all their business or to one or two suppliers. So the idea was the customer firm would say to these two suppliers or one supplier, I'm giving you so much of my business, and in return I want to make sure that I get high quality, first time right, and I get low prices, and you participate. When I'm developing a new product, you help me sort of reduce the cycle time towards developing the new product. So there were definitely benefits for the customers. And why were the customers doing this? They were facing competition from firms in Japan which were practicing such supplier focus, forming close relationships with the suppliers. So in order to become competitive, they were practicing supplier focus, and in return they expected I'm giving you so much of my business, I want to make sure you are certified before I give you my business. I also want to make sure that you're able to, I want products to be delivered just in time. So they were pretty demanding customers. Okay, so now the question became, what does it mean for the suppliers to have such demanding customers? So that's sort of what we started with. As I said, little was known about the impact of this move on the performance of supplier firms. Okay, so there were two overarching sort of questions for us as we were beginning this study. One was, as suppliers were to form these relationships, were they becoming over-focused on a few customers? So one was, does this preclude them from pursuing other more profitable opportunities? That was one question. The second question was, are these customers so demanding that the suppliers are not making any money? So those were the two key issues. And overall, the main overarching question for us was, is it profitable? Is it profitable for suppliers to pursue long-term relationships with these customers who are demanding and whose customer satisfaction may take a lot of resources? The other specific questions were, what happens to sales growth? As I said, does it preclude you from pursuing more profitable or more better opportunities? We also want to look at the cost structure. What happens to the cost structure? And if there are savings by being focused on a few customers, what is the source of the savings? And then also we want to look at price structure. Are these customers so demanding that your profit margins are very thin, or you're not making much money? So those are the questions we wanted to see addressed. And as we began our work, there were challenges that we faced. One was the impact of pursuing or doing relational versus transactional selling, pursuing relationships versus sort of selling on a transactional basis. One challenge was that to answer these kinds of questions, we had to do our empirical study over time. That is, we can't see the impact of doing relational selling over a few months. It had to be done over a few years. Second was, what are the benchmark issues? So let us suppose we want to see what happens with the sales growth of the relational firms versus the transactional firms. Let's suppose for the relational firms, sales grow. What can we attribute it to? So one thing we realized, not only we had to do the study over a period of time, years rather than months, but we also have to have some comparison, benchmark. So if we only looked at relational firms and their sales grew, it could be because of the economy. It could be due to market factors. So that was the other thing, that we had to set up some control firms, and what we would do is compare then the performance of firms that are doing relational selling with those that are doing pursuing on selling on a transactional basis. All right, so before we go any further, let's make sure we understand the difference between, I'll be using these terms throughout the talk, what is a long-term relationships and what's a transactional relationship. In a long-term relationship, typically these are multi-year contracts. The customer promises to buy a lot of the component part or do a lot of business with the supplier over a period of time. And so they are not, on the other hand, these are market-based exchanges and transactional relationships. I have a need for a part. I will put the need up and see who can supply me from the qualified list of suppliers at the lowest price. So that's a transactional setting. Here, collaborative actions. So in long-term relationships, both parties have an interest in growing the pie, making it a win-win situation. So good relationships would require the customer firms don't exploit the supplier firm. So preservation of the relationship is high, and they both want to maintain continuity in the relationships for the relationships to work. On the other hand, here it's more adversarial. Each party, the buyer is trying to buy at the lowest price, seller is trying to get the best price. So it's more adversarial here, and there's no attention paid to preserving the relationship for the long term. So that's the difference between, we're going to look at both types of firms in our study, and that's the difference. Now one of the important slides that I'm going to cover is the next one. So what we are doing here is basically we're going to take a supplier, relational supplier. And we're going to find a benchmark firm in our data. We use CompuStat databases for our study. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a relational supplier and find match it with a transactional supplier as similar to the relational supplier as possible. Okay? So we may form 50 such pairs, we may form 75 such pairs, but each pair at the start we'll try to make sure that at t equal to 0, they are as similar as possible. The SIC code that they are in, the business market segment that they serve, and their size in terms of sales. We're going to try and make sure they're as similar as possible, and the only difference between them is that one is doing relational selling, the other is doing transactional selling, as much as possible. We're going to do that. And then we are going to see, did we succeed in making sure they were similar? And then we are going to see what happens 5 years later. At time t equal to capital T, 5 years later, what did it look like on some target variables? Okay, so what we are going to do is find plenty of such pairs in the CompuStat database. And in each pair that we're going to track then, did the sales go up for the relational suppliers in majority of the pairs? And so we'll do a formal test of that. Okay? So that's what we are about to do.
Mike?
Yes?
Was this a choice or was this an equilibrium?
Meaning?
That is, the two players,
Yeah.
if the equilibrium is one would do relational and one would do transactional, was that the situation, or both of them willingly chose and you could have had a solution where both would be
Okay,
transactional?
so we do both ways. That is, we look at the data and say, we observe that they are doing, one is doing relational selling, one is doing transactional selling. So then we'll also look at a reduced sample of firms in which we look at the compact disclosure database. Now that's where that database contains corporate reports, SEC filings. So in that sort of reduced sample of 42 pairs, we're going to look at firms who deliberately were pursuing a relational strategy. That is, they were investing in sort of customizing products. They were investing in joint product development programs. So in their corporate reports, they were saying, this is a deliberate strategy on our part. So 76 firms Yeah, I'll tell you how we end up with, first we start with 76 and end up with then reduce it to 42 firms. Our results are stronger in the reduced sample where we know the relational firms are deliberately, proactively pursuing a relational strategy. Yes?
Just let me ask quickly.
Sure.
Even if this wasn't what you studied, when you were building the database, did you ever find cases where the customer firm acquired the supplier firm?
No.
No.
No. Now we begin to form the pairs. So what we started was, we started with first trying to form the relational sample of firms. And so we looked at, we selected firms which serviced these SIC codes. Now why did we sort of start here? Because it is in these SIC codes, computer and allied products, machine tool equipment, automotive products, etc. Though it's firms in these SIC codes which were facing international competition. They were trying to become more competitive. They wanted to do what Japanese were doing at that time, which is try to get higher quality from the supplier at a lower price and also have the supplier participate in product design programs and have also provide just-in-time delivery. So that's where we started. We started looking for firms in the CompuStat database, in firms that were serving customers in these segments. So we also, what we wanted to do was, we wanted to be as focused as we could, and so we took firms that sort of defining what's a relational supplier. We said we want to pick firms that do a majority, or at least 40% of their sales every year to the same set of customers. Okay, so select only those firms that have had the same sell to the customers every year. This was pertains to Anand's question, how did we define what's a relational supplier? So we looked at firms that were selling to the same customers at least 40% every year for the 6-year period. Okay? So now what is it that we do? We are now selecting the benchmark firms, the firms that are selling on a transactional basis. So for each of the firms in the relational sample, long-term LTR stands for long-term relational sample, we took a firm that was in the same SIC code and served the same business segment as the relational supplier. So they were in the same SIC code and served. We didn't want to look at firms that sold to multiple segments because we wanted to be as identical as possible between the two samples. So both the relational firm and the transactional firms were in the same SIC code, sold to the same business segment, and then we would be typically for each relational supplier would be left with 3 or 4 firms that we could choose for the control or benchmark firm. Okay, so we would then take the firm that had the same level of net sales at the start of the 6-year period as the relational supplier. So what we have, the goal was that at the beginning, the 2 firms in a pair should be as similar, same SIC code, serve the same business segment, and have the same sales. And then we'll see what happens to these firms 6 years later, or after a 5-year period. I'll say why sometimes I say 6 versus 5, I'll tell you. So we were able to find 76 matched pairs, where we were able to find sort of a relational supplier and match it with a control or a transactional supplier. As we said, each pair of firms are matched, operate in the same market, are classified in the same SIC code. Now here's the thing, have same level of sales in 86, 87. So sales are going to vary. Our data go from 86 to 91. But sales, there's variation in sales, so what we decided was to smooth it out. And that is, we're going to use the average over the 86, 87 period in finding sort of a similar transactional firm. So the control firm in each case serves as a benchmark to remove, as we said, confounding macroeconomic effects. Any macroeconomic effects applied to both the relational supplier and the transactional supplier. All right, so next, so here's what we do in terms of formal analysis for these two samples. So we used a Wilcoxon signed rank test. It's a non-parametric test. We felt our data sort of, it's robust and sort of doesn't require normality assumptions. And we did do t-test analysis too, but we started with, or we've done reported Wilcoxon test results in the paper. And so what we do is, and it turns out for samples of greater than 14, Wilcoxon test will yield a test statistic that is normally distributed. So I'm calling it, we are referring to it as Z. So what we'll do is in each target, for each target variable, we will do sort of a test at the beginning between the two samples to see did we succeed, for example, in achieving similar sales. Did they have similar sales? And then we will do Z2, which is look at them 5 years later. What happened to any target variable, price or gross margins or inventory holding costs or ROI. And then we also want to get insight into if sort of there is a change at the end, what explains the change? That is, the blue line, we'll use the blue for always the relational or treatment sample. And we look at what happened to within the treatment sample and also what happened within the control sample. So we're going to do 4 tests and get insights into each sample and between samples what's going on. All right, so the first target variable is sales growth. Okay, and so first our hypothesis is sales suppliers in long-term relationship with select customers are able to maintain growth over time. So the arguments for that the relational suppliers will have good growth is one, their goal is to make sure customer is satisfied. Customer satisfaction leads to loyalty, and therefore if the customer is satisfied, over time they'll get more of the customer's business. And also what will happen is the customer may expand the scope of the relationship. I'm happy, it's efficient to working with this supplier, I'm getting good results, and therefore not only I'm going to buy part A, I'm also going to buy part B and part C. Okay? And also remember, so one reason to expect growth, that the relational firms will do better, will have higher growth, is also these customer firms were requiring the supplier to be pre-certified. And so during pre-certification process, any problems in the manufacturing process would be identified. And so to the extent the supplier can say, I'm pre-certified, I have this ISO certification, they would be more competitive in getting other business. Also, if the customers are these important customers, they can become showcase accounts. I serve such and such a customer. So I should be able to, I can sort of make sure I get business and you'll be satisfied with my work. So those are the arguments for. Arguments against are that you are sort of getting tied up in, first of all, let's first talk about voluntary, which is your goal is customer satisfaction. It's not to pursue sales growth. So what you're trying to focus on is long-term and profitability. So you're sort of by definition, you're not trying to, so why relational supplier won't do well in terms of sales growth, one is you're focusing on customer satisfaction. Second is over specialization. You are working with few customers, so in a portfolio sense, you're not as diversified as you should be to handle recessions and this and that. And also what might happen is for the relational supplier, you're so dependent on few customers, that if their demand goes down, you suffer, right? So let me ask, what would you expect? Who does better? Do the relational suppliers will have higher growth at the end of 5 years, or would the transactional suppliers have higher growth? So this is a hypothesis where I'll show you the result in a minute, where our expectations didn't turn out to be true. We thought that the transactional suppliers would have a higher growth. Why? By definition, they want to be more opportunistic. They want to pursue sales opportunities. They are not focused on customer satisfaction. But that didn't turn out to be the case. Okay, so now we said we will do 4 tests, and here are the 4 tests. So Z1 compares sales growth at time t equal to 0. And what you see is Z1 is not significant. If anything, the relational sales are very small, but they're about the same. But then we look at Z2, what has happened is now we see Z2 is significant, at least at a 10% level. So both sales are growing. Both, the red line is transactional sample. Their sales grew after 5 years. But the relational sample grew more. And it might be the reasons we suggested. One is that there's a satisfied customer who expands the scope of the relationship. The relational supplier is pre-certified, is able to get other business based on that certification. So in any case, this is a relationship, or this is a result we did not expect, but we found that at least pursuing long-term relationships doesn't come at the expense of sales growth. All right, so now we're going to look at costs.
So,
Yes, please.
do you have data before 86? I'm curious about if you ran the clock in reverse, because you matched on an 86 year. Are there pre-existing trends that suggest that that's a continuation of an existing path?
No, I don't have. Okay. We did not look at that. All right, so now we look.
Sorry. A question regarding, this is from the supplier perspective.
All right.
I'm wondering what happened to the customer. Did the customer grow, or did the customer just move more of the business to the supplier?
Well, it'd be difficult. It's a good question. It'd be difficult because typically these firms would be serving lots of customers. So it'd be difficult for us to sort of say what happened to the customers. We didn't look at that. So I don't have results on what happened to the customer firms. Or what you're getting at is if the sales growth is coming from because customer grew. Mm-hmm. Certainly that's one possibility. But the other, there's evidence that certification helps. And also sort of work done subsequently is that I think benefit comes from expansion in the scope of the relationship. Not the same part, perhaps. That is, the customer is not buying more of the same, but is saying, I like this supplier. See, it takes effort to build a relationship with supplier. Typically, these relationships will involve not only buying the physical product, getting some service, having an EDI linkage. So they get locked in, the customer and the supplier. And so the customer ends up saying, this is working well. I'm buying part A. Why don't I buy part B also? In fact, at times, they will say, if you're willing to provide me third-party products, I'd be interested in that too.
So my worry here, and
Yeah.
this is the part I've been worried about, is that you may be selling more, but that doesn't mean it's a profitable thing to do.
Okay, we will look at profitability.
Okay.
We will look at profitability. Yeah. But yeah, that's what I'm coming to. That's what I'm coming to. Yes, Mohit.
About, so I see higher sales growth or whatever, but the variance, I mean, because they have sort of reduced their diversification, right?
Yeah.
So they are tied to a supplier and, I mean, tied to a
Customer.
and the customer at some point wants to break out or whatever. Were there cases
Yeah.
like that in your data?
Right. So, well, I don't know that in our study we did this, but what we find in such situations is, in fact, switching for the customer becomes harder. The customer sort of would have to set up an EDI linkage, would have to set up a relationship. And one of the big benefits to both parties in such relationships is there's learning over time. The supplier learns how to serve the customer. So typically what will happen is component part is being supplied to multiple locations of the customer. So all that knowledge, over time the supplier becomes more efficient at serving this customer. It's very difficult. So small price differences provided by another competitor to the supplier, the customer doesn't switch. So these procurement costs can be very large. And so the customer says, this is working, I'm satisfied with the quality first time right, I'm getting just-in-time deliveries. I don't want to switch unless there's a major reason to.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Are there cases in the data set where it's clear that because of this commitment, because I'm trying to understand, is there a higher risk for pursuing the strategy in some cases, in which case even though there is a potential gain to be had, should I be worried?
Well, so we didn't do this in this study, but in general we find these relationships do last a long time. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's look.
I have a question.
Yeah, hi Charlie.
I'm sorry I came in late, but did the customer have any investment in the supplier? I mean, would they have bought equipment
question.
that made it so that the
Good
supplier
question.
could
And you're
build?
sort of anticipating the end result here. But here's the thing, that is, these relationships work when both parties have a commitment to the relationship. So what we are saying is that in a way, typically the customer came to the supplier and said, I want to form a relationship with you. So that's a key, which is if there isn't commitment on both sides, that is typically the customer may be said, if the customer is larger than the supplier, as we found in the Caterpillar versus Johnson Precision case, there's a tendency to exploit the supplier. And so those relationships won't work. The customer has to realize that if I break away from this supplier, then I'll have to restart a relationship. The concept is good. The concept of me being able to go to a supplier and say, I'll give you so much of my business. In return, get pre-certified, deliver just in time. I don't want to carry any inventories. Do it right the first time. Help me with product development. So the customer likes the concept. And that's what Japanese were doing. And so the American firms, US firms said, we have to learn from that. And so yes, there has to be commitment. By commitment, I mean there has to be definitely investment in the relationship on both the sides. Any other questions? All right. So inventory holding costs. Now, one wants to look at not just inventory holding costs, but one wants to look at manufacturing costs overall. But there's evidence that inventory, a company that tries to minimize waste in manufacturing also tries to minimize waste in inventory holding. So there's correlation between, there's studies that at the time we did our work that showed that there's correlation between inventory, efficiency in managing inventory holding costs and manufacturing costs. We didn't have data on manufacturing costs that we could compare across firms. So what we did was we are looking at inventory holding costs. And if you bear with me for a minute, you'll see why we have data on inventory holding costs that can compare across 76 pairs. All right, so what do we expect? Our hypothesis is suppliers in long-term relationships with select customers are able to reduce inventory holding costs over time. Now, why we expect this might be true, and again, I go back to one main reason is learning effects. I know where I'm sending the parts, which plants am I sending the parts to. So over time, I learned that. Also remember, fundamentally, the whole idea is I'm giving you so much of my business. So there are economies of scale in serving this customer. There's less demand uncertainty. I know if I can buy something cheaply at a certain point in time, I will. So there are efficiency in purchasing because there's no uncertainty, less uncertainty about demand. Efficiency in manufacturing. I know when they need this part, I'll manufacture it in time. Tighter integration between manufacturing and distribution. I need to deliver just in time. I'll manufacture, set up a production run just in time. So there are reasons to expect, yes, holding costs will be lower. On the other hand, there may be a tendency to exploit the weaker channel. Customer may have more power in the relationship. Also, the customer said, I'm giving you so much of my business, I want just-in-time frequent deliveries. So when we looked at the Subaru-Isuzu relationship, when I was teaching the course, we found both the suppliers had to set up warehouses locally to provide just-in-time deliveries. So they're carrying not only they're carrying inventory. So there is reason to expect the inventory costs may be higher for the relational supplier. Okay, so here's okay. First, let me tell you why I said there's data in the CompuStat database on inventory. So look at the variable we are looking at. It's overall inventory turnover. That is sales divided by inventory. So if we look at one firm, we say, well, we're looking at the sales of this firm divided by the inventory holding costs of that firm. So we're going to, higher is the turnover, lower, more efficient is the firm in managing inventory, right? So because if inventory costs go down for the same sales, turnover will go up, right? So here's what we find. At the beginning, again, Z1, the two samples, inventory holding costs are similar. Later, what happens is the LTR sample becomes more efficient. Its turnover increases. That is, for the same inventory or same sales level, it has lower inventory. The transactional sample doesn't change. The turnover doesn't change. So they are able to, and to the extent inventory holding costs reflect manufacturing costs, we can say that chances are the manufacturing cost may also sort of be going down for the relational firms. Looking at the time here, making sure we have enough time. All right, so now we look at prices. Hypothesis is suppliers face pressure to reduce prices in long-term relationships. More formally, suppliers in long-term relationships with select customers obtain lower prices over time. Why that might be true? So pass on cost reductions. So these relationships were being formed with the expectation, if I give you so much of my business, you will learn over time, and therefore I'm expecting 5 to 10% price reductions every year. So to some extent, this was built into the relationship. So we thought we might see lower prices. That is, relational suppliers not being able to get a good, fair price. Customers get a better picture of the supplier's cost structure. Therefore, they say, I know this is what your costs are, and I don't need to pay you so much. Customers' relative power goes up over time. Supplier becomes dependent. And so for these reasons, we thought perhaps the relational supplier would not do well, would not fare well in getting a good price. On the other hand, as we said earlier, that the benefit of what happens in these relationships is not only you are providing the physical product, but you're also providing service, you're providing EDI linkage, and therefore, if you're able to communicate all the full sort of value that you're providing, you might be able to get a good price. So value-based pricing. I'm doing so much for you, not only with the physical product, but in other ways. The other thing we said a few minutes ago was it becomes difficult once there's a tight relationship for a competitor to the supplier to break in. And so it'll take a bigger price difference. So there were reasons for and against, and let's see interestingly what we find. Okay. Now, the variable we are able to, we can't compare prices across 76 different pairs and different SIC codes. So instead what we do is we look at gross margins that is price minus cost, if you will. Okay, so we are looking at percentage margin. Okay, and so it's price minus cost. Here's what we are finding. In the transactional sample, first of all, at the beginning, there is some difference. Transactional sample has better margins, but that difference sort of goes up over time. So the LTR, the relational sample, is not getting a good price margin. The margins here, if you look at the Z here, for the transactional sample, which sells on a transactional basis, they're able to maintain their profit margin. So if we put the previous hypothesis together with this one, we say costs are lower for the relational supplier. But the gross margin is despite a lower cost, the gross margin is lower. That is price minus variable cost. You're subtracting a smaller number. And so what is happening is the customer is able to bargain away the cost reductions that the supplier is able to achieve. And which is what we expected would happen. That is because this is how these relationships are built. I expect you to sort of, if you are lowering your cost, you will lower the price to me. Okay? Now, the overarching hypothesis was about profitability. And so we're going to look at what happens to, that's the question we started with, is it profitable for these firms to pursue long-term relationships with customers? So ROI is pre-tax income over assets or investments. And that's how we are going to define it when we see the results. Suppliers in long-term relationships are able to obtain higher profitability. Now remember, we are asking this question even though the profit margin is lower for the relational supplier, right? So let's keep that in mind. Okay, why might the relational supplier have a higher ROI? Well, greater efficiency in servicing customers over time. We are back to that same proposition, learning effects. Over time, I'm able to, if both parties are investing in each other, I'm able to improve, become more efficient in serving the supplier, so profitability should improve. Importantly, lower customer turnover. I'm not, as a relational supplier, I have a long-term relationship with this customer or with a set of customers. I'm not seeking new customers all the time. I'm not investing in marketing and selling expenses trying to find new customers all the time. First time right approach. Well, so if it's product design or a product quality issue, I'm pre-certified, and also on product design, I try to be first time right, and so there are no delays in product redesign, so I'm not wasting money trying to fix something when I should have delivered it first time right. And of course, as in answer to Charlene's question, mutually beneficial. Both sides, if the relationship is working, both sides are trying to help each other out or be collaborative, so ROI should be higher. On the other hand, level of required could be in excess of return obtained. This is what we talked about. There are cost reductions, but the customer is able to drive down, bargain away those cost reductions. Preclude the opportunity to, so by focusing on a few customers, you are foregoing opportunity to serve more profitable customers. So this is the overarching question, and let's see what we find. All right. So now the data are from 86 to 91. 88 was the downturn year. 90, 91 was a true recession. All right, so here's what happens. The transactional sample experiences, if you look at Z4, decline in profitability. Now, in part, that was because of recession or downturns and recession. Whereas the relational sample is able to maintain its profitability. So Z3 is not significant. So despite a lower profit margin, what we are seeing is the relational supplier or relational suppliers are doing better. So that was a mystery we wanted to solve as to why is that the relational suppliers, so it can't be the profit margin. It has to be perhaps something, a discretionary expense that's lower for the relational suppliers than it is for the transactional suppliers. So for discretionary expense, we turn to SG&A, selling, general, and administrative expenses. And so what you find is that the LTR sample, those discretionary expenses are remaining flat, Z3 is minus 0.01. But it is going up almost significantly, Z4 is equal to 1.55 for the transactional sample. So in a time of recession, in a time of downturn, the transactional supplier is having a harder time finding new customers. So one big reason is, we say in marketing all the time, it takes less business, less cost to work with an existing customer than working with a new customer. And so one benefit, major benefit to the relational supplier is less turnover. They're serving the same customers. And if the relationship is working, it could be lasting for a long time. All right, so overall, summary of results, suppliers in long-term relationships are able to improve their profitability levels to a greater extent than suppliers in the transactional sample. We saw that in hypothesis 4 through more efficient and marketing, less turnover, and more efficient marketing and selling expenses. Due to lower costs, that is, they are able to, over time, learn how to serve the customer and therefore have lower inventory utilization costs, lower manufacturing costs. Maintaining long-term relationships does not come at the expense of sales growth. We saw, in fact, the relational sample had a higher sales. Maintaining long-term relationship leads to lower prices over time. The customers are able to bargain away the cost reductions. So lastly, at the time we started our work, lower manufacturing costs, there was evidence, lower manufacturing costs was true, that the relational suppliers had lower manufacturing costs. So we go beyond that and look at profitability. And so the question overall, I think what Charlene asked at the beginning, which is, so does this, our study is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. So we're not saying that suppliers should go and pursue long-term relationship with all customers. That's not what we are saying. What we are saying is that yes, those relationships work when there is commitment on both sides. Both sides are investing in the relationship. And of course, what we find is for the relationships to last, there should be trust built over time, and there should be good communication in the relationship between the customer. And so every company has does some relational selling, but also does some transactional selling. So it has to select, suppliers have to select customers with whom they would be in their interest to form long-term relationships. And typically what happens is the customer comes to the supplier and says, I want to form a long-term relationship with you. And where they work is where there's high volume being exchanged, which justifies investments in EDI, just other kinds of investments. So that's where the relationships work. So we're not saying suppliers, therefore, in results, given our findings, should pursue long-term relationships with every customer, but where there's commitment on both sides, they work. Any questions? Yes, Mira.
So you talked about kind of long-term, you categorized them as long-term relationships when 40% of their business was to the same company.
Right.
Did you examine variability in what percentage, right? So if the more
At least
customers you have,
okay.
the worse it is. Or the
All
better.
right, good question. So there was at least 40% of each of the years that we looked at. For the relational supplier, at least 40% had to come from the same set of customers. Now, as I said to Anand's question, answer to Anand's question, is in the reduced sample, that number, that was a proactive strategy on the part of, so we had a sample here of 76 firms, there we had a sample of 42 firms. Results are in the paper, they're much stronger. The results are much stronger for the reduced sample. Yes.
So I'm thinking about the fact, so let's consider Caterpillar, and Caterpillar's competitor is John Deere.
Right.
So if I built a long-term relationship, I mean, things are different between Caterpillar and Kirby Risk right now, but in that period, when they were supplying more, if Kirby Risk supplied more to Caterpillar, effectively, their options to supplying to John Deere goes down, because if you know so much about one player, you give up the other player. So I'm just wondering about the portfolio for the supplier. You put all your eggs in one basket, in which case you effectively picked a winner, and if Caterpillar is not the winner, then you go down the...
Yeah, I think, so this strategy may preclude you from pursuing profitable opportunities. But when we did this work, and I would go around making presentations, one of the things what we would find is that so a supplier could be serving both Caterpillar and John Deere, could be. But there was sort of, and let us suppose there's some discovery of efficient way of doing something, then this would come up for discussion all the time, which is, can I pass this innovation to John Deere then? And so typically what would happen is any discovery would have a protection of about 9 months to a year. Okay? But it doesn't preclude altogether. But chances are you are sort of not as diversified as the transactional supplier.
Just to give you a current condition, right now, Kirby Risk is across the street from Caterpillar and find it a hard time to get a contract from them. So.
Yeah. So I want to be careful with what I say. At the time we were doing the study, the Caterpillar had a reputation for being very tough. And we would have students in our executive programs who would talk about that. And in fact, Johnson Precision folded. That was one of the relationships we studied.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Manu.
Thank you.